So today I've been pretty torn, honestly, thinking about like what should we cover on Sunday, because there is so much we could cover and so little time. And we're also kind of behind because last week I thought I was going to be able to cover the whole book of Exodus with everyone, and then we only got to chapter 24 instead of chapter 40. So I think what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and see the forest rather than looking at the trees when it comes to the book of Leviticus, and kind of think about like, why is this book here and why is it important, and then from there we'll zoom in and look at just two stories in Exodus and then in Leviticus, and we'll see how they're connected to each other. So Leviticus, I was talking with a college student this weekend about just the titles of the books in the Old Testament, and the first 5 books of the Bible, they're written in Hebrew, and then they're translated into Greek around 300 BC, 200 BC. And then those Greek translations, they have names that we have now like adopted into our English. So Leviticus, that's not what the book is called in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's Vayikra, which means he calls. The names of the first 5 books of the Bible are usually the first words that are in Hebrew. So the Lord called, Vayikra, like that's what this book is called. Leviticus is from the Greek translation of it, and it's Leviticus. It's the book given to the people of Levi. Like that's the idea, because it's Levites who work in the temple. They call the book of Numbers because there's a census at the beginning and at the end. Deuteronomy is Nomos, second law. This the second giving of the law. Exodus is called Exodus because of the theme and story of the book. But in Hebrew, the first book, Genesis, is actually called Bereshit, in the beginnings. And the second book is it's Va'el Hashem. These are the names. And then, because then you get that first genealogy right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Then this one's Vayikra, he calls. Then Numbers is actually called the wilderness, because it all takes place in the wilderness. And then Deuteronomy, I can't remember the name of that. But I thought he calls is a cooler name than Leviticus. You hear Leviticus, you're like, oh my gosh, here we go. So we're going to look at a book called He Calls. And the entire book of Leviticus, it all takes place at Mount Sinai. So they're not traveling in this book. And the entire book is a book of speeches from God. Like this is God speaking to Moses and speaking to Aaron. And he actually speaks there. You can see this phrase, the Lord called to Moses, and it shows up 37 times in the book. The 37 times. So there's 18 and 18, and the 19th one to make that 37. The one right in the center is the center of the book, which is the important piece of the book. So there's something in biblical scholarship when we think about how to study the Bible called a chiasm. And a chiasm is a way to structure literature. So the basic concept is that you have phrases or lines that reflect each other. So on a really big scale, this can happen, or on a really small scale. So reading through the Psalms, you might start seeing things like this, where the first line and the last line actually match each other. And then where the second line and the second to last line, they match each other. The third line, the third to last line, they match each other. And it all brings your focus into the center. This is called a chiasm. Just think about it being like a valley or a mountain in literature. Yeah, Daniel? Ooh, can I spell chiasm? That's a great question. Chiasm. Yep, chiasm. So this is really common in Hebrew literature, and this is one of the primary ways that they use to convey meaning. So the way you structure something It is a form and a method for communicating meaning. Anytime you tell a story, when you tell a joke, usually it's a 3-line setup and then a punchline, or 2-line setup, then a punchline. So that's a structure that helps you convey meaning in a joke. Same thing in biblical literature. Chiasms are one of the most popular ways that biblical authors use to convey meaning. And it's also, this is really weird and foreign to us because we usually like to have the meaning at the very end of a book or the very end of a page. So we expect everything to rise up to a conclusion. So we're really familiar with this type of narrative, which is like plot, tension, climax, and then the resolution. And we do also see that in the Bible, but not in the linear sense to where the very last pages are going to tell you what the meaning is. In an email when we were going through Genesis, we were doing the story of Joseph. And I sent an article to you guys. I don't know if you ever read it, about Joseph weeping. And he weeps 7 times in the narrative. And the first and the last time they correspond to each other. And it all brings your attention to the center, which is kind of in the center of the story when Joseph weeps and he embraces his brothers. It's like the picture of reconciliation. But so that's where the focus is, but it's not at the very end of the story. So sometimes it gets confusing. And then when we read through stories, it's like we get to a point in Abraham's story where yet again, he's handing his wife over to someone like Abimelech, and he's like, here, this is my sister, like, do with her as you please. And you're like, didn't he just do this? And you feel like the Bible's being repetitive or almost being clumsy or sloppy in their writing, but we're just not familiar with this style of writing. So the reason I want us to know about this is because this is what the Torah does, the first 5 books of the Bible. So there's 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and they are a chiasm, and they're bringing our attention to the center book, which is Leviticus. So I was on the college retreat this weekend. They're going to be here at 11. I came back early, and during free time, I just sat and I did some drawings. So here is my drawing, and I think I can make it a little bit bigger. Maybe not. Preferences? Well, let's not worry about that right now. Okay, so here is the Torah. Each one was an individual scroll that existed, and they're linked together by the way books end and the way books begin. And let's just think about Genesis for a second. Genesis begins with God forming a beautiful garden in Eden, and he takes humans and he puts them in the garden to work it and keep it. As the story from Genesis 1 to 11 goes, they continue to rebel against God and move further east away from God's presence until they land themselves in Babylon, or Babel, and they're building the Tower of Babel. Well, after that narrative, we have Genesis 12 through 50. And Genesis 12 through 50 starts with Abraham being called out of Babylon and placed in the land of Canaan. And then as the story goes from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there's a slow descent out of the land of Canaan and into the land of Egypt. And the way the book of Genesis ends is with Joseph dying and being buried in a grave in Egypt. So it's like corresponding Egypt to the grave. We also have, towards the end, Genesis 49, we have Jacob, one of the patriarchs. He gives a blessing onto the 12 sons of Israel, and then he dies. Okay, now we're just going to jump all the way over to think about Deuteronomy. If you're unfamiliar with Deuteronomy, it's okay. It's the end of the journey right before they cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and Moses is giving the pump-up speech. So Moses is standing there. They're in the land of Moab, and Moses, this patriarch of the faith, he pronounces blessings over the 12 tribes of Israel, and then he dies at the end of the book, just like Jacob dies after giving his blessings to the end of the book. And it's all leading up to Canaan. So Genesis starts in Canaan and ends in Egypt. And then the narrative of the Torah is them leaving Egypt and arriving back at Canaan. So the destinations of the beginning and the end, the locations, Canaan, Canaan. So Canaan frames like that big narrative of the Abraham family storyline. Will you close the door?
Yeah.
Then we can zoom in and think about Exodus and Numbers, the books that frame either side of Leviticus. And Exodus starts off, the first 19 chapters are about the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt. And this happens through miraculous plagues that God performs through Moses. And then they're wandering through the wilderness, and there's some crazy things that happen out there. And they arrive at Mount Sinai, where they have this encounter with God. And then remember that really riveting reading that we did from chapters 25 through 40, where you hear the plans of the tabernacle, and then you hear them building the tabernacle. Like, it's all about the tabernacle, and they're constructing and building the tabernacle up. Well, then when we jump over to the book of Numbers, the first half of the book of Numbers is about the tabernacle, except for instead of setting the tabernacle up, they're tearing the tabernacle down to begin their journey. So it's about them deconstructing the tabernacle to then start their wilderness journeys. And then they're still at Mount Sinai. And I think it's in chapter 11 or chapter 10, they set out from Mount Sinai now with the deconstructed tabernacle. And they wander through the wilderness, and they go through Kadesh, then they go through Moab, going to Canaan. And all of that is centered on the book of Leviticus. So it's drawing our attention to this book of Leviticus. And Leviticus itself is a chiasm. So I've been reading, if you wanted a resource to love Leviticus, this book, Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? It's a biblical theology of the book of Leviticus. So if you thought Leviticus was fun to read, imagine reading this. It's a lot of fun. Honestly, Michael Morales. Miles Morales is the new Spider-Man. Michael Morales is the biblical theologian. But he points out, one scholar structures it that there's law, narrative, law, narrative, law, narrative. This one's a little iffy in my opinion. And then law, but there's this sequence of what is that, 7, 3, so 7. And it centers you on a single narrative, which is Leviticus chapter 16. Leviticus 16 is the center of the book of Leviticus. It's the Day of Atonement. So that's the center of the book of Leviticus, which is the center of the Torah. So if you're wondering, like, man, what is the Torah about? Well, you can turn to Leviticus 16 to find out. Another thing is, as I mentioned, there's the phrase that God spoke to Moses, or God called to Moses, and that phrase shows up 37 times. It shows up 18 times on this side, and it shows up 18 times on this side, and the 19th time, the center moment that God speaks to Moses and Aaron is in Leviticus 16. And then from there, the topics in these sections also correspond to each other, where Leviticus 1 through 7 and 23 through 27 deals with sacrifices. It deals with things that are happening inside the tabernacle and the sanctuary. 8 through 10 and 21 through 22 deal with the priests themselves. This is the narrative about the consecration of the priests, and then Nadab and Abihu getting fired on the job. And then this is about the qualifications of a priest. Then you move into 11 through 15, 17 through 20, and those become focused on the individual Israelite and things about being clean and unclean, being pure and unpure, being holy or common. So these things over here usually these all deal with being clean and being purified through blood. These things have to do with like moral purity and holiness in regards to one another. So there's this progression where everything on this side has to deal with blood and becoming clean. And then things on this side have to deal with living holy as God is holy. And it's as if once you pass through the Day of Atonement as a reader, you have been purified, and now you learn how to be holy. So that's a narrative structure. But wait, there's more. Now let me give you a zoom in on Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the second half of Exodus Remember, you have that really short story where there's bitter water and it's turned into sweet water. Moses throws a tree into the water, and the water that's there in the ground, it becomes drinkable. Then right after that, you have a narrative about the water from the rock, where Moses goes and he strikes the rock that God is standing before, and it pours out water for the people. Then right after that, there's a war with the Amalekites. That's the one where Moses has to hold his arms up, and his arms are getting heavy, and so people go and hold his hands up. Then after that, chapter 18, there's leadership relief for Moses. That's when he's speaking with his father-in-law Jethro, and he gets recommended. He's like, you should really establish elders over the nation of Israel. You should have 70 elders to help you govern the people. And then in that chapter, there's this weird little description about Hobab, which is the son of Jethro. So it's the son of Moses' father-in-law. There's just like this little comment where he's like, hey, Hobab, you should come with us. That's basically it. Then in 19, 1 through 20, they arrive at Mount Sinai. The rest of the book of Exodus is about the tabernacle, this tent of meeting. If we jump and look at the book of Numbers, it starts with the tabernacle, except for instead of the construction of the tabernacle, it's tearing down the tabernacle, how to do that properly, and then carry it away from the camp. And then in 10, 11 through 23, they depart from Sinai. And then there's this little discussion with Hobab where Moses says, you should come with us. And then in chapter 11, there's leadership relief for Moses by the instruction of Jethro, his father-in-law. And then in 14, they have a war with the Amalekites. Then in chapter 20, they find themselves at a rock once again. And instead of Moses speaking to the rock like he's supposed to, he strikes it twice, and the water pours out from the rock. And then in 21, 16 through 18, there's a story about a well, which is water from the ground. So then we zoom out and we can see, so those stories on either end of Exodus and Numbers, they're mirror images of each other. They've flipped the image, and then we can look at the book of Leviticus, which starts off looking at the sanctuary, then it's priestly stories and commands, then it's personal stories and commands. And on the flip side, it's personal, priestly, sanctuary. And all in the center is the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16. So this is all macro structure stuff. It's helping us see the significance and the importance, the theological importance of the book of Leviticus. So the entire Torah, it kind of operates as a liturgy. As we read the Torah, we are proceeding through this liturgical process where we are leaving death and we're entering into the sanctuary, and then we exit it holy and clean, and we learn what it means to walk as God's people. So this is the scriptures that form the nation of Israel, and also what forms our Lord and Savior Jesus. Like, these are really important to him. We did like a year series in the book of Hebrews, which for chapters, the author of Hebrews is riffing off of Leviticus 16. And he's talking about how Christ is the high priest who enters into the holy place on our behalf and offers his blood. And because his blood was a once and for all sacrifice, Jesus' priesthood never ends. And because his priesthood never ends, we have a great high priest, and we have a confidence before God because he's entered the true holy and holies, not the copy that is on earth. So understanding the book of Hebrews starts by understanding the book of Leviticus. So if you've ever read Hebrews and you're like, what the heck is going on? Well, read Leviticus like for a year straight, and then you'll love Hebrews. Any questions on like the big picture structure stuff of these books? Yeah.
To what extent do you think this was to help with memorization?
Ooh.
I know like some psalms are anagrams, and each one's a different letter to help with memorization. So I didn't know if the structured in this way as well. Like if you memorize the first half, you just that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's for memory purposes. That's a good question. Yeah, because the Torah was memorized by a lot of people. It's not like everyone had a copy of the Bible themselves. There was, in each community, there was maybe a copy of the scroll, and you did it in a community, and they would sing through these stories, and they would sing certain parts, certain times of the year. I don't know. That's a really good question. Maybe it was to help with memory. Yeah, Daniel?
There are
Mm. Mhm.
that they'll shine
Mhm.
as
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that scholars in the past have, non-Christian scholars have done in the past is they'll look at things like this and they'll be like, well, see, it's just repeating the story over and over again. Like, this story didn't actually happen twice. That would be silly. This is just sloppy writing. This disproves the Bible. But they're coming at it from a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of the Bible, that the Bible's primary aim is to communicate to you the historical unfolding of sequential events, which is not its purpose at all. As we're reading through, like, a lot of these stories are not in sequential order. For example, when you read chapter 10 of Leviticus, it's about Nadab and Abihu dying. Then you get like 5 chapters or 4 chapters, 11 through 15 of purity laws about being clean versus unclean. And then chapter 16 starts with the Lord speaking to Moses and Aaron when the sons of Aaron died in the sanctuary. So as far as sequential, chapter 10 and chapter 16 are happening at the same time. Like, it's one unified event, but they've been disunified by all these laws. And then when we're reading through Exodus, like, there are so many timeline things that are wrong. When we get to the book of Judges, the things that happen at the end of the book are actually the things that happen first in the timeline. The Bible is not trying to tell you primarily a timeline. We can reconstruct timelines from the Bible, but the Bible is more concerned with the meaning and message of this history of the people of Israel that God has redeemed out of Israel. So it is interesting that Moses and the other prophets or the authors of the Bible, they looked at the history and said, here's how we could better tell this story to communicate truths and realities about who God is. And they draw our attention to things like the Day of Atonement. So if there's not any more questions on structure, I thought we would go to the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16. We would look at that for a little bit, and then we're actually going to backtrack to Exodus 32 and 34, and I'll tell you why after we do Leviticus 16. Lo and behold, Leviticus 16 is a chiasm. It has reflection points in the beginning versus the end. Most notably, this is today's reading, I think, right? You guys haven't read Leviticus 16 yet? You have? Today? This was the day? Yesterday?
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. All right, so you're just ahead. So I thought we would just read through it. I'm not going to comment on everything, but we're going to draw our attention and focus to what is the center of this chiasm in Leviticus, which is verses 15 through 20. Because if that's the center of Leviticus 16, and Leviticus 16 is the center of Leviticus, and Leviticus is the center of the Torah, then those few verses are maybe the most theologically important to the entire Torah. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat and shall have the linen undergarment on his body. He shall tie the linen sash around his waist and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering." So he's preparing for this ceremony, and this is in direct response to what just happened with Nadab and Abihu. So Nadab and Abihu had gone into the sanctuary in an unclean way, and they died because of it. in chapter 9 of Leviticus, you have the high priest being consecrated, and he performs the rituals properly, and God appears to the people in fire, and people fall down and worship, but they're safe. And then chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu go in an improper way, and God, again, just appears the same way. He appears in fire, but they die because of it. So because of their unclean state and because they do it in an improper way, they die. So this is a response to that, to protect the priest, but it also is showing that priests are not safe just because they're priests. They are also people who need cleansing. They're also people who need forgiveness of sin. So Aaron, now the high priest, he's going to have some sacrifices for himself, and then he's also going to have some sacrifices for the nation of Israel. So this is like a two-parter where he's going to make sacrifices for himself and his family, and then sacrifices for the nation of Israel and for the tabernacle. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. You probably have a footnote right here, like I do. The meaning of Azazel is uncertain, possibly the name of a place or a demon, traditionally translated as scapegoat. Also shows up in verse 10 to 26. So it's just a word that we don't know the meaning to. It might be a reference to the wilderness. So they're going to send a goat out into the wilderness, and the wilderness is symbolic of death and separation from the presence of God. Azazel could also have this meaning of complete removal. I think when I click on it, yeah, and it has similar roots to entire removal, so it might mean that. It also might be the name, as it says, of like some sort of wilderness demon. Now, even if it was a name for a wilderness demon, it doesn't mean that Israel is giving sacrifice to Yahweh and then giving sacrifice to appease a wilderness demon. Because in chapter 17, God directly forbids the sacrificing to goat demons. So just for clarity's sake, it's like, this is not a sacrifice to a goat demon. If anything, if it were some sort of demon in the wilderness, it's symbolic of God handing over the sinner to the demonic powers. So that would be the picture if it was a demon. But this is one of the words that as the Torah was passed on generation to generation, like they were convinced, like they're like, everyone knows what Azazel means. We don't need to like tell people what this means because it's so common. And then it actually did get lost. But even if we don't know the meaning precisely of that word from the context, we can know the meaning of this Azazel. And that's why translations in the past have done scapegoat, because they're trying to convey the meaning of what is taking place. Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell to the Lord and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. So just for clarity, it's being presented alive before the Lord, not being presented alive to Azazel. And then it's sent away to Azazel. So that's why this is not a goat sacrifice to some sort of demon or something else. Like this is a sacrifice being made before God. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. So not just himself, but like for his children and those who are children of his children. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small. And he shall bring it inside the veil and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die. So remember, God says that he's going to appear in the cloud. And this is different than when the glory cloud descends on the tabernacle. Here, this is a cloud made from sacrificial incense. And it's almost as if even in the Holy of Holies, Aaron is going to be encountering the presence of God, yet unable to see his face because it's clothed and covered in this incense smoke, so that he does not die. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his fingers on the front of the mercy seat on the east side. And in front of the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. Here is the center of this whole chapter. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside the veil, and do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it over the mercy seat and in front of the mercy seat. So after he takes the bull for himself and his family, he goes into the Holy of Holies. He sprinkles the ark and the seat of atonement with the blood. So then he has cleansed that space, and he's been atoned for himself. Now he can represent the people. So he goes back out of the tabernacle, and then he makes a sacrifice for the people. And then again, he brings the blood in, and this blood is for the people of Israel, and he's doing the same thing for them. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place, because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. So the atonement that's being made, the covering of sin and uncleanness that's being made, he says it's also for the holy place. So it's as if the place of God, the tent of God, has become impure because of the impurity of the people of Israel. So this isn't just about cleansing or covering for the people of Israel, but also for the tent of meeting, and it's purifying the tent of meeting. Because of the uncleanness of the people of Israel, and because of their transgressions, all their sins. So this atonement is for all their sins, the thing that separates God from the people of God, and the people of God from the personal presence of God, all their sins. And so he shall do for the tent of meeting, which dwells with them in the midst of their uncleanness. No one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. Then he shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it, and shall take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat and put it on the horns of the altar all around. So this is a cosmic theater that's taking place. And once this journey begins of the Day of Atonement process, no one can interrupt it. The high priest has to go in and then come out being successful to make atonement for himself and the Ark of the Covenant and the holy place. Then he's able to represent the people. So it's like the people would be standing in anticipation, like, is he even going to come out the first time? Because if he doesn't come out the first time, then we're screwed. So everything's relying on the success of the high priest in entering the holy place, coming out successfully, and then re-entering on behalf of the people. Verse 19, and he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his fingers 7 times and cleanse it and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the people of Israel. And when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both hands on the head. This is different than in previous chapters where it's just one hand. So he'll lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. Those 3 words are important. All their iniquities, all their transgressions, and all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. The goat shall bear all their iniquities, shall bear all their iniquities. If you're nerdy, you should underline bear their iniquities. All their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. So there's the centerpiece of this chapter, verses 15 through 22. Like, that is the center. If you're like, man, what's this chapter about? Just like circle those ones or bracket them. But there's kind of a lot going on. There's a lot of detail, and the details are getting repeated as we're reading through it. So it's kind of hard to keep track. So here's a simplified picture. So there's really these 2 sacrifices being made. There's an atonement sacrifice in death, and then there's the quote unquote scapegoat where sin is removed. So first you have the sin offering, the burnt offering, where the sacrifice is made and there is a death on behalf of sinful humans. A penalty is paid by a blameless animal dying for non-blameless or guilty sinners. And that innocent blood then represents the people and is brought into the tabernacle and cleanses the tabernacle and also presents the people before God. So one sacrifice is to bring the people before God. And then there's the other sacrifice, which is this goat or the scapegoat, both hands are laid on it, which is symbolic of removing the sin from the people, away from the people. So you have both a death for sin and a removal of sin. It's not a one or the other. If you just had the sin sacrifice, the one that is killed, then there would be death for sin, but sin would not be removed. So there's both these pictures of death for sin so that you may enter the presence of God, and the removal of sin so that you are clean. So those two pictures are the two realities of the Day of Atonement that are necessary. And then if we kept reading from there, then we hear similar things like Aaron's going to take off the linen and he's going to bathe himself again. And the one who is in readiness, he's also going to bathe himself, just like at the beginning. So this is the center of the Day of Atonement. I think what would be helpful is to draw pictures and try and visualize the tabernacle just a little bit more. It might not help you, but it definitely helps me. So that's what we're going to try and do real quick. So if you're a drawer, get a blank sheet in your notebook and we'll go from there. Okay. My dimensions are just slightly off. I haven't memorized 25 through 31 of Exodus yet. But that was a joke. Okay. Here's our poor drawing of... I need to fix this. This is embarrassing. So we get all this detail in the Torah about the structure of the tabernacle, but I think rarely do we visualize it. If you have an ESV study Bible, there will be pictures and charts that kind of show you a picture of it to help you have a visual. But even still, it's hard when we don't have one of those. So it's helpful just to see the layerings that are going on. So this right here that I'm drawing right now, this is the Holy of Holies. It's in the center. The Holy of Holies. This is where the Ark of the Covenant is. This is where the full covenant presence of God is. So we're just going to write Ark in there. It's in the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is described as a perfect cube in the Bible. Its length, height, and breadth is all the same measurements. So it's a center cube in the center of the tabernacle. Then the Holy of Holies is within what's called the holy place. And this is where you have the menorah, which is the giant tree-like candles thing. And it's also where you have the table of bread, of showbread. And then this line right here, this is where there's the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place. And the veil is decorated with cherubim on it. Cherubim are on the veil. And there's also, there's like an incense altar in here. But the menorah shines light. When we get to Numbers, it's always supposed to be shining light onto the bread of presence. And there's 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's as if God is always shedding light on what provides life for the nation. Then outside of that, you have the altar. And you also have the basin, which is like this big brass thing that has like water in it and symbolic of the sea. And outside of the tabernacle, though, you have another altar. This altar is for the people of Israel to come to and make their sacrifices. When we were reading chapters 1 through 7 of Leviticus, there's all these different types of offerings that the people of Israel are to be making. There's sin offerings, there's thanksgiving offerings, there's peace offerings, and all that is taking place out here. And the Israelite himself who brings his sin offering, he's the one who slaughters his goat and puts it on the altar, and the priest oversees it. The priests do work in here. So priests are allowed in here. Israelites are allowed out here. Directionally, this is east. This is west. East, going east, is the direction of exile and death in the Bible. West is the direction of redemption and life. So every time the high priest is performing the Day of Atonement ceremony, they are symbolically going westward in redemption for the people of Israel and entering into life. When the scapegoat is wandered off into the wilderness, scapegoat goes east. Remember in Genesis when Adam and Eve sin and then they're driven east of the garden, and then Cain kills his brother and he goes east from there into the land of Nod. And then the people after the flood narrative, they're just evil and corrupt and wicked, and they go east and they settle in the plains of Shinar and they build this Tower of Babel. So east in the Bible is a direction towards death. West is a direction towards life and redemption. And all of this is calling us back. It's an echo back to the Garden of Eden. That's why the way the tabernacle is decorated, the way it looks, the storylines is all harkening back to, what if we could be back in Eden? What if we could re-enter the temple presence of God? What if we could dwell with God again? So the tension of the Torah is that the presence of God has been lost for humanity. Adam and Eve walked with God. The descendants of Adam, Enoch, walked with God. And then as you continue to go, when you get to Abraham, it doesn't say that Abraham walked with God. It says that he's supposed to walk before God. And then think about the way people's interactions with God changes throughout Genesis. Abraham spoke with God. He would have these encounters with him where he's seeing him like I'm seeing you, and they would talk, they would discuss things, and God would tell him what to do, and then he would go. By the time you get to Jacob never talks to God like this. He has obscure apocalyptic dreams, and it's like he's being removed in this journey away from God. And then when we get to Joseph, Joseph just has obscure dreams that need to be decoded. So it's as if the relationship with God is being slowly removed throughout the process that we're reading. And this is the solution so that man can walk in the presence of God again. It's restoring that problem. So when the Day of Atonement is happening, Aaron comes in and he is doing the sacrifices for himself. And he goes into the holy place, he sprinkles blood, and then he goes into the Holy of Holies and he sprinkles some blood, and he makes atonement for himself and for this place. He cleanses the entire tabernacle. Then he comes out and he makes the sacrifice for the people. And he makes a sacrifice for the people, and he brings that blood in, all the way into the presence of God, and then back out. And then he lays the hands on the scapegoat and sends the scapegoat into the wilderness. Any questions on this so far? Charlie, you look like you're thinking.
It's not how it was not a way of salvation, more just how they the righteous.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't for people who were Gentiles.
Yeah.
Saved.
Yeah. So, and the atonement sacrifice, if we kept reading, we get prescription for them doing the Day of Atonement every year, and it's for the nation. It's not just like for any person. So it's in a sense one goat or one lamb for a nation, and it's those who have committed to being God's people, who have taken upon themselves this covenant, and in faith they believe that God's presence really is in the Holy of Holies, and that through this sacrifice that they are presented before God. So this is not a narrative of works-based salvation. It is a narrative of they believe and they trust that God is faithful regardless of whether or not they can see it. Like, they don't get to see any of the stuff in there, but they believe that God is there, and that this is the means by which they can be more inclined towards his presence and to be with him. Yeah, Daniel.
So on the note of how noticing how person in the Bible interacts with Abraham, direct talking,
Yeah.
Jacob, Joseph, dreams that even more extreme and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Is this symbolic of humanity slowly falling away from Eden? And the second thing is as Adam is slowly falling away, and you're like less direct interaction, whatnot, what happens?
So it's like the less and less interactions, which is a picture of the fall from Eden, until you get to this point. It's like this is the answer to that problem that we've been seeing, that man continues to be separated more and more from God. And the solution to this problem is atonement. Atonement for iniquity, sin, and transgression, to cleanse the people from all their sins. And what you need for true atonement to take place is you need both a death for sin, an innocent death for the guilty, and you also need the guilt to be removed from the people. So when we get to Jesus, like, that's what Jesus is doing for us. He is an innocent one dying for our sin, and he is removing the sin from us. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus shows up on the scene, John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Takes away the sin of the world. That language is atonement language. But in this story, remember, it's two goats. So what story in the Old Testament is significant when it comes to a lamb being killed? Passover, which is the blood being smeared on the doorpost, and death passes over. So John the Baptist is merging these two really important days, the beginning of the calendar year, and then the 7th month of the calendar year for the Israelites, the day of Passover and the Day of Atonement, a lamb and the removal of sin. Passover is not about sin. The death of the lamb and the blood smeared over the doorpost, that's not a sin offering. They're just trusting that God's going to be faithful to spare them in his promises. The one that deals with sin is Day of Atonement. So when John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God," it's Passover, "who takes away the sin of the world," that is Day of Atonement language. So that's what's going to happen all the way through the gospel narratives when we get there, is everything that happens with Jesus' death, it happens on Passover. It's Passover week that Jesus is dying. But all the language used about his death is Day of Atonement language, that he is dying for sin, that he is removing sin, that he's cleansing the people of their uncleanness. So these two key pivotal stories in the Torah get merged together in significance. And we'll see that later on in the Old Testament. When we get to the book of Nehemiah, these two ideas are already merging to where the people of Israel are realizing that what they need is not just a new Exodus and not just a better Day of Atonement, but they need an event that does both of those for them. So all of this let's see, 9:52. Let's go to the book of Exodus instead. Okay. I want to show you that Exodus 25 through 40 corresponds to the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 27. So Leviticus, you have all the details about cleansing rituals, sacrifices, and really everything is surrounding around the priest's role, either in the tabernacle or for the tabernacle. And then after the Day of Atonement, you also have the same thing, but it centers on this narrative about atonement. When we're in Exodus, chapters 25 through 31 are about the designs of the tabernacle and about the designs of the priestly garments. So it's about the tabernacle and the priest. And then chapter 35 through the end is about them constructing and actually making the tabernacle and the priestly garments. And it all centers on a story that takes place over the span of 3 chapters, Exodus 32 through 34. And we are going to read them together, and you're going to see how awesome the Bible is, hopefully. Okay, let's get there. And let me get my notes out. Okay. Okay. Let's do this. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings and gold that are in your ears, and your wives, and your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. Where'd they get the gold? From Egypt. So they have all this gold from Egypt, and now they're going to become like Egypt in their worship of false gods. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So what a sad story. Moses, they can see on Mount Sinai, there's this huge cloud of glory and the mountain is consumed with fire. God's presence is right there. And instead they want a little toy cow to worship instead. And Moses, remember, he's getting plans for the tabernacle and for Aaron to be the high priest. All these plans about how Aaron is going to be the one who represents the people and intercedes for them. And then down at the bottom of the mountain, Aaron's being a buster and kind of blowing the story. And Aaron takes from the people, and then he makes, and then they're eating, and then it says they play. And the word for play, I don't know if anyone has a footnote or a different word for play. It could mean that there's like sexual things going on. So just think of all the stories in the past in Genesis where people see what's good for themselves and then they take it, and then the sexual promiscuity that follows. Well, that's like all playing out at the bottom of the hill right now. And the Lord said, yeah.
What exactly did they offer?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know. The text doesn't say. They had lots of flocks with them. So when the people go down to Egypt in Genesis, the 70 people and probably their servants also, they have tons of livestock, and they settle in Goshen because they tell Pharaoh, like, hey, we're shepherds. So he gives them the land of Goshen. So to think for like a few hundred years, they've been raising cattle and sheep and goats in the land of Goshen. So they leave with all that. So it might just be one of those things that they're sacrificing.
On the altar,
Mm-hmm.
you would sacrifice, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cut its neck, depending on how they're doing it. Sometimes they would take parts of the lamb's body away from it and then burn it. Sometimes they would burn the whole thing. So we don't really get the details of what it is, besides that it's a burnt offering. And usually the burnt offerings, you burn everything on the altar. And it's the idea that the smoke rises up into the heavens, and the blamelessness of the animal that's burned on your behalf is your presentation before God. But here they're down at the bottom and they're sacrifices. So it's really ambiguous about like what they're doing or what their motives are or what they even think is taking place.
So what was the odor like? Altar.
Mm.
Must have been horrible.
Yeah, it does say all throughout Leviticus that's a pleasing aroma to God, but I guess for us it probably didn't smell great. But barbecues smell good when flesh is burned. It might not have been horrible, but it might not have been great. But I don't know. That's one of those things where it's like you could go to a foreign country right now and you could probably still experience the smell. I mean, they're making sacrifices to deities today, and they either burn animals or they just slaughter them. Blood has kind of like an ionized smell to it. But yeah, I don't know.
So what's a peace offering? What offering?
The peace offering I think that's in Leviticus 3. That one, they don't offer the entire animal. So the fatty portion is given to God. And that doesn't mean like the fat of the animal, but the meat that is fatty is given to God. Think of like a really marbleized steak. Like that is the portion that God gives. And so what's happening with a peace offering is it's as if the people are bringing an offering and they're having a meal with God, where some of the meat they take and some of the meat they give to God, and it's burnt on their behalf. But the idea is that they come to a table and they both partake in a meal together. So the peace offering is symbolic of the relationship of having a meal together. Keep asking these after we go through this story. All right.
Peace offering, is it burnt?
They burn part of it, but it's not a whole burnt offering. So whole burnt offerings are different than a peace offering, even though they both get burned. A whole burnt offering, everything is burned. Mm-hmm. Yep. The very end of Leviticus 7, it like gives a summary of all the things that you read. So then you can backtrack and like read through those details on each thing. It's hard to keep track of like the entrails and the dung and what you do with everything. But let's keep reading through this and see how this is matching on to Leviticus. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people." This is interesting. God says, "Your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone,' or leave me alone, 'that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation out of you.'" This is the second time that it's mentioned in the Bible that God is wrathful or angry. First time was with Moses, when Moses was saying, "I don't really want to go." Like 5 times over, finally he just said, "Will you just send someone else?" And God's anger was kindled against Moses. Now here, God's anger is kindled against the nation of Israel because of their rebellion. And God says, leave me alone that I may destroy them, consume them because of their corruption, because they've already broken the covenant. And I'll start over with you. I'll make a great nation of you. Because this entire narrative, the nation of Israel is liberated so that God can be faithful to his promise to Abraham. God promised to Abraham that he was going to make a nation out of Israel, that he was going to bless Abraham, not out of Israel, out of Abraham. He was going to bless Abraham, and through Abraham, he was going to bring blessing to the entire earth. So God is going to be faithful to that promise no matter what. God passed through the cut apart animals, not Abraham. So he's going to be faithful to that. And here, God's solution, because the people just broke the covenant, he says, well, I'll wipe them out and I'll start over with Moses, because Moses is a descendant of Abraham, and I'll make a nation out of Moses, and I'll reboot the nation project to bring about the blessing. And yet I'll still be faithful to my promise to Abraham. So this is not God going back on his word whatsoever. The nation of Israel have already broken the covenant. Therefore, the covenant can be viewed as void. But Moses is going to intercede. But Moses implored, he begged the Lord, his God, and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. So this is the first intercession of Moses. And Moses' tactic is to say, well, God, let's think about your reputation among the nations. Even he doesn't say, oh, they don't deserve to be destroyed. He says, you know, the Egyptians might think less of you. The entire book of Exodus so far has been so that the people would know that he is the Lord. Over and over again throughout the plagues, he's saying to Pharaoh, so that you may know that I am Yahweh. Over and over again, it's to show the reputation of God. So Moses first says, well, it might give you a bad reputation. And also, you know, you might still be able to be faithful to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a different way, rather than destroying them. So God relents of destroying the entire nation. There's going to be 5 intercessions, and each time it's going to change the relational dynamic between God and the people. Verse 15, then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. The tablets were written on both sides. On the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a noise of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the sound of shouting for victory or the shout of crying of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. So it's as if now Moses is in the role of God and he's experiencing what God was experiencing. He's like, what the heck are the people doing? And now he's burning with anger when he's actually seeing what's taking place. Where he burned hot and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. This is symbolic of the breaking of the covenant. The covenant has been broken, so he throws down these tablets and they break. He took the calf that they had made and he burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. So this is like ironic that God says, I'm going to bring about punishment for what the people have done. And Moses is like, no, don't punish them. And then Moses comes down the hill. He's like, what are you doing? And he punishes them. He like grinds it up and he makes them consume the very thing that they were worshiping. It's the judgment is actually consuming the thing of idolatry that they face. And Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? He's like, man, they must have threatened my brother that they were going to kill him or something. Here is Aaron's response. And Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. Basically what Moses just said to God. You know the people, that they are set on evil. For they said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Like, man, talk about deniable plausibility, right? So here you have a narrative once again, just like in the garden when God comes to Adam, and he says, he confronts him. He says, what have you done? And Adam says, it was the woman that you gave me. And the woman's like, it was the snake. Moses comes down and he says to Aaron, what have you done? And Aaron's like, it was the people. And I just threw it in the fire and out came this thing. So they're denying guilt. Verse 25, when Moses saw that the people had broken loose, for Aaron had let them break loose to the derision of their enemies, that's another reason to think maybe there's a little bit more foul play going on. Instead of just like a dance party, it might be like a dirty dancing party going on. The derision of the enemies, Leviticus 18 might give some color to that. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is on the Lord's side? Come to me. And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. So basically, who is still wanting to be faithful to God? Who's not participating in this? Come to me. All the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on the side, each of you, and go to and fro from the gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion of his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. And Moses said, today you have been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day. We get to this section where we're like, whoa, this seems super brutal that God slays people by the hand of the sword of the Levites. But remember where we just were. God was about to kill everyone, the entire nation, except for Moses. And when we get to the book of Numbers, there are thousands and thousands of Israelites. There's a little over 600,000 men listed and numbered for who are over the age of 20. So that's not counting women, and that's not counting children under the age of 20. So they're probably well into the million category as far as how many people there are. And instead of killing everyone, only 3,000 died. This is a story not of God's cruelty, but of God's mercy and his kindness. I would imagine if like you were at with a group of people and then there was a really rambunctious group that were troublemakers worshiping and having like a sex party, you would know which ones they were. And there's the cry out, if you're for the Lord still, come out. And some people don't go out. They're like, screw this Yahweh guy. Like, I don't want to do that.
Well, they came out of Egypt and they lived there 400 years. Mm-hmm. They had to have kind of knowledge of all the Egyptian gods. They're trying to cleanse them of all those gods, but they still are reverting back again and again because that's what they knew.
Maybe. But when Moses is sent to the people of Israel in Egypt, he goes to the elders and he's coming with the divine name. He says, Yahweh sent me, and they know. They're like, oh, Yahweh sent you. Okay. So they haven't lost their heritage.
So now they have Yahweh. They also have those other gods. No Yahweh's above them.
There's nothing, there's no inclination in the story that the Israelites were worshiping Egyptian gods. There is no hint in the narrative. So the way we're presented is that the Israelites are still descendants of Abraham who are in a land not their own, but they worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You got a question?
And there was like a thing going on, maybe going on here, but they found out that other cultures, like they thought that because it's superior, but like they have borders, like gods are like rulers of nations, not one ruler of the entire planet. So I wonder if that trend is possible.
I'm not sure I track with you, but tell me about it after we can do this, okay? Okay. So instead of the whole nation dying, only 3,000 die. The next day, Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. What is the Day of Atonement all about in Leviticus 16? It's about atonement. So here Moses is wanting to make atonement for their sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, so this is the second intercession. He said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. So here's the attempt of Moses. He wants to make atonement for the people. He goes up to Yahweh. He says, will you forgive them? But if you won't forgive them, instead of killing them, kill me instead. Moses goes up on a mountain and he offers himself as an atonement sacrifice for the nation of Israel. He is saying that let me be the lamb in their place that dies. Remember, Moses in this narrative, he is innocent. He was not a part of the rebellion because he was up on the mountain and God wanted to start over with him. But now the innocent one is offering himself as an atonement sacrifice for the guilty. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they had made the calf, the one that Aaron made. So God says no to Moses, but he's not saying no to this idea. The trajectory of the biblical narrative is that one day there will be a blameless human who will make atonement for not just a nation, but for the entire world. So he's saying no to Moses, but he's not saying no to this idea. But still, in this second intercession, now rather than killing people, God sends just a plague on the rebellious people. Then chapter 33 begins. The Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying to your offspring, I will give it. I will send the angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. So now God's saying, I'm still going to give you the things I promised you. I'm just not going to go with you. You broke the covenant. I'm not going to be a part of this journey. I'll send a protection hedge for you. I'll clear out the land, but you guys are on your own. You broke the covenant. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, you are stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments that I may know what to do with you. Therefore, the people of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. Then we get this all of a sudden just like breaks into this story as like a little it's like a little filler of the reality the people of Israel are used to experiencing. Now, Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he would go into the tent. And when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. So it gives this portrait of like, well, what used to happen is God would speak to Moses face to face, and now God is saying that he's not even going to go with us. Like, this is a problem for Israel. This is why this story of intercession is important. Moses said to the Lord, so here is intercession number 3. Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up the people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, so he's still interceding, if I've found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. So here in this intercession, it leads to God saying, okay, I will go with you. I won't abandon you. Verse 15. And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. And Moses said, here's the fourth intercession. And Moses said, please show me your glory. Please show me your glory, your revealed perfections. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But, he said, you cannot see me face to face, for man shall not see me and live. So this face to face is in regards to seeing God's glory, his perfections. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not see. So Moses asked to see the glory of God, and the essence of the glory of God that God is going to allow Moses to see is God's goodness. God's goodness is God's glory. It's a diminished glory. It's like it's coming through a blind, so it's not quite as bright, but Moses is still going to see the truth of God, even though he's not going to see the fullness of God. Yes.
Didn't they just say that he would speak to Moses face to face?
Used to. But now something has happened.
So he used to be able to see God face to face. Now
Yep, and then there's a distinction. Sometimes face-to-face is used as far as the relational connection that Moses has with God, or that God has with the people. But here, the face-to-face is in regards to God's nature. Because what Moses asked for is not, show me your face, show me your glory. In other words, show me your nature and your divine qualities. And God is saying, if you saw that, if you entered into my divine presence, you would die. But instead, I'll show you part of it. I'll show you my goodness. Yeah. All right, we're leading into the last intercession. Then the Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablet which you broke. Be ready by the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on the top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite the mountain. So Moses cut the 2 tablets of stone like the first, and he rose early in the morning and went up on the mountain as the Lord had commanded him, and he took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. Then the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of Yahweh. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. 3 key words that are in the Day of Atonement narrative in Leviticus 16. Iniquity, transgression, and sin. And when it says forgiving iniquity, remember in Leviticus 16, I encourage you to underline the bearing iniquities of the goat after laying the hands on. It would bear iniquity. That word for bear is the Hebrew word nasah, which could also mean carry. And it's the word right here for forgiving. Nasah, that God will, in other words, God will bear the iniquity and the transgression and the sin. He'll carry away the iniquity and the transgression and sin. So we have all the same key language in Leviticus 16 as we have in this story right here. But who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the children's children to the 3rd and the 4th generation. That's not saying that he's going to punish children for the sins of the father, but rather to each generation, God is going to relate to them on their terms, and he will punish them for their sin, and he will reward them for their faith. So on one hand, God is gracious, merciful, slow to anger, abounding steadfast love, and he is willing to remove sin from people. And yet at the same time, he will not forgive the guilty. The solution to this is, well, we're all sinful, but the difference between someone who is guilty and someone whose sin is dealt with is atonement. They allow atonement to happen on their behalf. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshiped. And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for he is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. That's the 5th time Moses intercedes, and then the covenant is renewed. So all of this story here of Exodus 32 through 34. In 32, you have the very explicit statement by Moses that Moses goes up on the mountain to make atonement for the people of Israel. And his idea of how that can happen is if he who is innocent dies in their place. And then 34, the end of this narrative, so 32 through 34, the end of the narrative has all these key words from the Day of Atonement. Bear, or nasach, to carry, iniquity, sin, transgression, that God will carry, will remove those things from his people. Then you have Leviticus 16, which is about atonement being made for the people of Israel so that their sin, iniquity, and transgression is carried away or bared away from them. So these two stories help give a portrait of each other. Leviticus 16 is the center of the Torah. Atonement is the center theological truth of the Torah. That the way that sinful man can be reconciled to a holy God is through atonement being made. The death of an innocent one for the guilty and the removal of sin from the guilty. And the portraits that we have of atonement in the Bible are things like Moses, someone who is a king of the people and a prophet of God, and yet a priest even to the high priest, being the willing sacrifice to atone for the nation. This is all building basically the resume of the Messiah for when we get to Jesus and to see what Jesus is doing for us, that he is the innocent one who makes atonement, and he only has to make one atonement. He doesn't have to do it every year as a perpetual sacrifice. It's an eternal sacrifice that's a once and for all done deal. So that's what Hebrews 9 and 10 is all about. Questions on all this or questions about Leviticus? We have just a few more minutes.
It's really hard for me to get my mind around all this. Maybe I'm supposed to be able to.
It's very foreign for us. So,
what did the people think at the time about the scapegoat? That all the sins supposed to be on the head of the goat. And he goes off. What happens? I mean, what's the thinking? Where the sin goes?
So the Day of Atonement is basically a theater that's being played out of like these divine and cosmic realities. So they're watching like the cultic performance take place. And as they watch the high priest go into the Holy of Holies that second time to make atonement for them, remember the high priest, the stones on his chest, there's 12 stones that bear the names of the tribes of Israel. And then he has these things on his shoulders that also have the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the high priest, he represents, it's as if he carries the people into the presence of God. So as they're like out in the court and they see the high priest going in and coming out, they're like, we have now entered the presence of God. And then when they see the scapegoat leaving, it's celebratory that their sins and everything that makes them impure has been removed from them. They've been cleansed. So it's a vicarious application, but that's also what is true for us in Christ, that we, through faith, we are made righteous. The righteousness of Christ is applied to us. That's called imputation. And also our sin is placed on Christ. Christ was put forward as a propitiation by his blood. That's Romans 3:25. So that's a vicarious application that happens through faith. So they're experiencing that in a smaller scale with the scapegoat. Yeah.
So, quick question out of curiosity, speaking of the 12 stones,
Mm-hmm.
the engraved names on each of the stones, are they actually the names of the sons of Jacob or of Israel, or the tribe names? So instead of Joseph, like his two sons?
It would be the two sons. Yeah. Ephraim and Manasseh, the half tribes.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So tribe names.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have one other cool thing to show you that I think I made a reference to it in an email. It's Leviticus. Let's see. It's about when you have a kid. What is that, 12? Anyone remember? I think I said to ask me about it. Clean animals. Oh, yes. Purification after childbirth. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel. If a woman conceives and bears a male child, she shall be unclean for 7 days. And at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are complete. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. When the days of her purifying are complete, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female. If she can't afford a lamb, she can do 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her. So you have a kid. After having a kid, you go to the temple and you consecrate your child. Hold on there. You consecrate your child by making a sacrifice. You're supposed to bring a lamb. If you can't do that, you do 2 turtle doves. Well, all the way in this book called Luke, there is little baby Jesus. And Jesus is presented at the temple as a little baby. When the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, which we just read, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord. And here's what's quoted: a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. And so here's the scene. They come to the temple, and you get this little detail that, they only quote pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So one inference that you can make is, so Jesus is from a poor family. But I think the better inference to make is you go back and you read that section and you say, well, the thing that you're supposed to bring to the temple is a lamb. And they brought the lamb to the temple, who in 33 years is going to be slaughtered outside of the camp on the hillside. So Leviticus is being connected into the New Testament all the time through little details like this, where you're supposed to bring a lamb, and here is Mary bringing her son, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, to the temple to be consecrated to the Lord because he is holy. Yeah.
So, burnt offering is a sin offering.
There seems like there's nuance there's like overlap. There's like burnt offerings that are sin offerings and burnt offerings that aren't. That's Leviticus 1 and 2 that cover burnt offerings. But for the most part, they seem like they're specifically sin offerings. But the idea of the burnt offering is that it's a blameless animal and the entire thing is burned up and the smoke goes up into the heavens, into the place of God, and presents the one who was sinful as being blameless before God.
Would the burnt offering be the sins of the people, and the sin offering be offering for that specific person offering it?
No, in Leviticus 1, individuals bring whole burnt offerings and make whole burnt offerings. And that's the same phrase that then Paul uses in Romans chapter 12 when he says to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. The idea of being a Christian is that now, rather than killing yourself on the altar, that everything you do is a whole burnt offering before the presence of God. We can keep talking about this, but let me pray for us, and then everyone else is free to grab some coffee. Father, thank you for this morning, and thank you for the book of Leviticus. As hard as it can be to read, God, there is value in your word, even if we don't quite yet have eyes to see it. And God, we ask that you would make us lifelong learners of your word, and that as the years go by, you would soften our hearts to books and sections like Leviticus and like the genealogies, where we see the history of our own faith being clarified and being presented with more color and vibrancy than we previously saw. So God, help us as we continue reading through Leviticus. Help us see Christ more clearly in the finished work that he has accomplished on the cross through his life, death, and resurrection. God, we love you and we need you. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.